A warm welcome to you all to this kickoff of the RESLIDE Research Consortium. It's encouraging to see so many of you here. My name is Åsa von Schultz, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Helsinki, and I'm also the leader of the Research Consortium. RESLIDE stands for the Resilience of Liberal Democracy in Finland. The consortium is funded by the Strategic Research Council and is set to be active for 6 years. We live in troubling times. Around the world, democracy is faltering. According to the most recent report from the Wiedem Institute at the University of Gothenburg, we are experiencing a global wave of autocratization that is both spreading and deepening. The level of democracy for the average world citizen is back to the same level as in 1985, and by country averages, it's back to 1996. The world has fewer democracies than autocracies for the first time in 20 years. Liberal democracies have become the least common regime type in the world. In 2024, there were only 29 countries in the world classified as liberal democracies. This wave of autocratization involves fragile democratic countries collapsing and already authoritarian regimes growing even more repressive. And it's a truly global wave of autocratization. According to Wiedem, Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia are in particular steep decline. But what is of even greater concern for us is that the threat against democracy, the decline of democratic quality, has now reached our part of the world. A part of the world where democracy for long has been taken for granted. North America and Western Europe are hence no longer immune against these trends. The level of democracy in the region is back to 1983 by country averages. For a long time, the collapse of democracy was seen by scholars as sudden events, often a result of abrupt military coups. But today, the pattern looks very different. Democratic backsliding of today tends to take place from within the political system itself, often driven by democratically elected leaders who, when granted political power, use their position to gradually erode norms and institutional safeguards until there are very few limits left on their power. In the recent year, developments in the United States have shown how fragile democracy becomes when leaders who disregard its rules and norms gain power. Donald Trump has pushed the boundaries of the American democracy and its institutions through mass dismissals of public officials, by overreaching executive orders, and by attacks on minorities, the media, and academic freedom. The strategy is clear: to undermine anything that limits or challenges his presidential authority. And this is not only happening in the United States. We have for many years observed similar but slower developments within the borders of the European Union, with Hungary as the primary example. Hungary was a liberal democracy in 2009 when Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party came to power. Once in power, they started rolling back checks and balances in a textbook example of contemporary autocratization. Hungary has since 2018 been classified by Wiedem as an electoral autocracy. It is hence not even considered as a democracy anymore. Democratic backsliding, erosion of democratic rules and norms is hence not a distant phenomenon, but rather something that is happening within countries of our geographical and cultural proximity. It has become clear that it can happen here as well. This is where RESLIDE steps in. The aim of our research consortium is to evaluate the resilience of liberal democracy in Finland. And we also set out to present remedies for how it can be safeguarded. The primary objective of the consortium is to identify the key risks of liberal democratic regression, assess their potential implications, and to develop measures to prevent such developments. The consortium consists of 5 different partners: the University of Helsinki, the University of Turku, Åbo Academy University, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and the University of Eastern Finland. The consortium brings together a team of researchers with various types of competences, but primarily with substantial knowledge on democracy and expertise from the fields of political science, international relations, public administration, economics, computational linguistics, and data science. This combination of disciplinary methodological competences, as well as access to infrastructures and unique data, will allow us to study the topic of liberal democracy, democratic resilience from a broad range of perspectives. RESLIDE and its research agenda departs from the distinction between liberal democracy and majority rule. The majoritarian principle holds that the will of the majority should be sovereign and that the many should prevail over the few. However, in a liberal democratic system, the executive power must be limited by checks and balances, minorities must be protected, and equality before the law must be upheld. And in addition to this, academic freedom, freedom of expression, independent media, and an impartial judiciary are all cornerstones of a liberal democracy. In the RESLIDE consortium, we will explore democratic resilience through different lenses. At the core is the question of support for liberal democratic principles. How solid is this support? Are there apparent variations in support within the general public? And perhaps even more interesting, under which conditions are people willing to compromise with democratic principles and, for example, support political leaders who push for unliberal or undemocratic alternatives? Uniquely, we will not only study the preferences of general citizens, but we will also include elected politicians and public administrators, both key actors in a well-functioning democracy. Here, our key research questions are: to what extent do citizens, elected politicians, and public administrators support both majoritarian and liberal principles of democracy, and under which circumstances? And how can commitment to liberal democratic norms, especially among the younger generations, be enhanced? And how can central actors within the political system, that is, public administrators or politicians, act to prevent democratic backsliding? RESLIDE also has a strong international and comparative focus. Through theory-informed case studies, we will examine how the increased plurality of democratic norms in the international arena, the contestation that exists over what democracy means and entails, how that shapes the behavior of political actors and influence the stability of political systems. Here we are asking, how does the increased pluralism in how one views democracy, what a democratic system is, at the national, regional, and global level challenge liberal democracy? We will further study inequalities in political participation and representations and their interconnections with democratic norms. Equality is crucial in terms of democratic support, given its potential to strengthen social cohesion and mitigate open political conflict and polarization. Addressing inequality can facilitate consensus building among political elites and enhance their willingness to engage in compromise and adherence to the constitutional principles of democracy. Here, our key research question is, what are the implications of inequalities in political participation and representation, and how can interventions contribute to their reduction? Finally, the consortium sets out to investigate undemocratic public discourse across both online forums and formal political arenas. And we do so to identify patterns and trace any hidden authoritarian potential in Finnish society, its scope, and the arenas where the risks are most pronounced. Our final research question hence reads, how can we identify anti-democratic discursive developments preceding open democratic regression? RESLIDE is a research project or a consortium with a strong focus on societal impact. We aim to raise awareness about the vulnerabilities of liberal democracy and strengthen the state's capacity and resilience against illiberal tendencies. We will test methods to mobilize groups with low voter turnout, reinforce democratic norms among young people, and develop an early warning system to detect undemocratic discourses. We live in turbulent times. After decades of progress, liberal democracy now faces serious challenges. In RESLIDE, we tackle these challenges with independent scholarly research, and we do so in collaboration with key stakeholders. We will spend 6 years with the utter goal to strengthening democracy's resilience in Finland, but also elsewhere. RESLIDE stand with liberal democracy against anti-democratic trends. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in the topic. It's also my pleasure to introduce our invited keynote speaker, Professor Giovanni Capoccia, who is indeed a professor and a professor of comparative politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. Professor Capoccia's research focuses on democratic self-defense against illiberal and anti-democratic forces, which aligns closely with the research agenda of RESLIDE. Democratic self-defense is also the topic of his current research project, titled Back from the Brink, Countering Illiberal and Liberal Democracies. But I will not say more about that because I expect that Professor Capoccia will talk about it more in his keynote speech. I think it's also worth noting that while many scholars today, as the scholars in RESLIDE, are very attracted to the topic of democratic backsliding and how democracies can protect themselves against such developments, the topic is far from new for Professor Capoccia. His earlier work on democratic crisis in interwar Europe has been published in several journals, and his monograph titled Defending Democracy from 2005 won the APSA Award for the best book in European politics. Please welcome Professor Giovanni Capoccia to the stage.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you very much, Osa, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for the invitation, and thank you all for being here, and also to those of you who are connected online. I am extremely happy to be here at the inauguration of this important research project, RESLIDE, the Resilience of Liberal Democracy in Finland. And as Asa was just saying, the study of democratic resilience, or the study of democratic self-defense, and more particularly, the ways and possibilities that liberal democracies have to defend themselves against illiberal, anti-democratic, and extremist actors has long been one of the focuses of my research, and probably the most important focus of my research. Okay, so that's the title of my, of my lecture, Countering Illiberalism in Liberal Democracies, Information Legacies, Temporality. Let me start with an anecdote. Not many years ago, with a colleague at Princeton, we were trying to organize a conference on this. We had a very hard time finding 6 or 7 scholars across political science and comparative constitutional law that would be interested in this. As you can see, a lot has changed. Perhaps not for the best reasons, but a silver lining perhaps is the fact that many academics now, and the academic community as a whole, is taking a very serious interest in these problems. And this conference, and RESLIDE as well, is an example of that. So, this is my research question, how it fits in the literature and the purpose of my project. What can pro-democratic actors do to counter backsliding, and more generally, as I will say later, this is an important aspect of the project, illiberalism in liberal democracies? Now, the literature on democratic backsliding is burgeoning and developing very fast. Still, is mostly not on counter strategies. There's an exception to that. Many people that study EU have focused on that, the supranational aspect of this problem, but counter strategies still have a lesser place, let's say, in the interest of academics, vis-à-vis democratic backsliding itself. Then there is a long-lasting and long-standing literature on what I call long-term strategies. Economic growth, redistribution, or cultural policies that, educate to democracy, civic education programs, and so on. These are very important, but of course they take a long time to have effects. And we have, and that's why we're all here, an urgent problem. We cannot wait for people to change their mind in a generation because the problem is here now. There is, as I was saying before, a literature on counter strategies that is emerging. But this consists, oftentimes, on what I call first-order lists of desirable actions. These are the things that can be done, but then how you get them done is often not clarified. There is limited attention to what allows certain strategies to be implemented. So the first thing that we need to do is to pitch the analysis at the correct level of abstraction. Any first-order list that says, do these 10 things and you will be fine, is likely to be wrong. For the simple fact, there's many reasons for that, but for the simple fact that it will likely be obsolete very soon. As technologies change and new ways to challenge liberal democracy are found, new responses will have to be developed. So any research, we need to start with the right foot in a certain way. Any research should be pitched at the right level of abstraction, and this is what I will try to do here. And the purpose of this project is to set a research agenda on the condition of viability of short-term, because we have an urgent problem, strategies to prevent, contain, and resist illiberalism. Now, let me say something before I start about the project from which this paper comes. It's called, as also said, Back from the Brink, Countering Illiberalism in Liberal Democracies. It's co-edited with a colleague of Yale University. It includes these papers. And these are all forthcoming. Some of them have been published already. Others are forthcoming in a special issue of a journal. And what I'm presenting here is the theoretical introduction to this project. So let's start with the scope. Where does this apply to? What I'm going to say. It applies, first of all, to liberal democracies. And I give a minimal procedural definition that is well known, and I won't dwell on that, of what a liberal democracy is. As I said before, it focuses on short-term strategies that are the least studied in the literature and are the most urgent to study. So there is a strange imbalance between the importance of these strategies and the attention that we give to them. What I'm going to say models responses to newly emerging illiberal challenges. As you know, I think also mentioned Hungary before, a newly emerging challenge can also be directly from the government. So the typical newly emerging challenge is a new illiberal party that comes up and becomes stronger. But we also have had cases in which a party that was considered mainstream, generally of the mainstream right, went to government and started backsliding from government without much expectation that he would do so. And the examples are many. Fidesz in Hungary, the Likud in Israel, even the Republican Party in the US can be argued. So new emerging challenges doesn't necessarily mean only parties that come out from society. It can mean new governments that, from a reputation of mainstream politics, turn illiberals. As I was mentioning before, this project aims to broaden the focus of this nascent and growing political science literature that focuses on responses to backsliding, that is to say, when illiberals are in government, to situations in which illiberals are in opposition. Illiberals are not necessarily born in government. Sometimes they rise from society and go to government. Sometimes they decide to be liberal when they are in government, and then they're kicked out of government, and therefore in opposition. So we need to elaborate theoretical tools to understand both situations, when illiberals are in government and when illiberals are in opposition. And to this goal, I delineate here 3 scenarios. These are ideal typical scenarios. Countries will be more or less close to these ideal typical scenarios, but I find that they help organize our thinking on that. So in a first scenario, as I said before, an illiberal challenge rises from society. So it becomes a relevant political actor, and it might become strong and dangerous. And this is a situation in which we would have to think about responses to these challenges in terms of prevention. A second ideal typical scenario is one of containment. An illiberal party or coalition is in opposition, but is one election away, according to most predictions, from winning government. And a third scenario, and in this case, should be contained, and a third scenario is the familiar scenario of a backsliding government that should be resisted. Okay. This scenario that I just mentioned allow to do several things, but one thing that they allow to do is to clarify our mind on what success means, okay? Now, success can be defined success in countering illiberals, I mean. Success can be defined and will be defined in many, many ways by the individual pro-democratic actors that fight illiberals in different circumstances. But we need concepts that travel across countries and in time in order to be able to compare cases. And so here I simply identify minimalist and maximalist definition of success in each of the 3 scenarios. So in a scenario in which illiberals are in government, what is success? Well, at the minimum, it should stop further backsliding on the part of the government. In a more optimistic, maximalist version of success, definition of success, it should defeat, the pro-democratic actor should defeat electorally the liberals in government, push them to opposition, which would then move the scenario to one of containment. And the logic is the same. In a scenario of containment, the minimal goal that the pro-democratic forces should have, instead of preventing the liberals from going back to government, and the maximal goal that they should have is to make them smaller and turn the scenario into one of prevention. And in a scenario of prevention, again, the minimal goal should be to stop the rise, and the optimal goal should be to make them insignificant. Now, the other thing that these three scenarios do, they allow us to understand and to classify a bit, sorry, the countermeasures that can be done, that can be taken against liberals in the three scenarios. I'm not going to go through the whole table, but what I want you to focus on here is that there are three types of response: formal, that consists in legislation or judicial decisions and so on, regulations and so on; informal, that are about informal discrimination, informal exclusion in various arenas, as you can see there, of the illiberal actors; and then mobilizational measures that aim to mobilize either in electoral campaign or in civil society protest against the illiberals. And these are possible in different ways in the three scenarios. And one thing that emerges once we do this, bringing together all the different separate fragmented literature that talk about these measures, you can see that the stronger the liberals, the less it can be done. Okay? So when liberals are on the rise, more things can be done against them than when they're in government. This seems intuitive, but trust me, I've had a lot of people telling me, oh, really? Why? Well, it seems clear to me. When they're smaller, since pro-democratic actors have to respect the rules and norms of liberal democracy that can be bent but cannot be broken, it's easier to do so than when the illiberals are very big. Okay. We need to know, however, what happens not only across the three scenarios, but within each scenario. Because, in general, we are in one scenario, and we want to know what to do to fight illiberalism in that. So, let me talk about these two scenarios first: prevention and resistance. In synthesis, a preview of my argument is this. I argue that at the core of the possibility of successfully countering illiberals in liberal democracies is a temporal paradox. And this applies to the two scenarios that I just mentioned: prevention and resistance. Why is that? Because these are dynamic scenarios. What do I mean by that? I mean by that the threat, the liberal threat, can change in dangerousness, in size, in importance within the same scenario. Containment is a slightly different scenario, and I'll talk about this in the last part of my talk, when I talk about long-term analysis. Okay, what does the paradox consist of? First of all, at the beginning of each of these two scenarios, illiberals' intentions are unclear, sometimes concealed intentionally, sometimes simply unclear. There's low information, there's high uncertainty on how serious, how dangerous the threat to liberal democracy actually is. Politically usable evidence of illiberalist intention, and therefore the extent at which democracy is under threat, the more information there is that is politically usable about this threat, the more pro-democratic actors are likely to succeed in defeating illiberals. However, and this is the paradox, this information generally is linked to the illiberals themselves, meaning to their activities, to their following. The more they do, the clearer the threat to democracy becomes. But the more they do, the less can be done against them without breaking democratic rules. So, or, as I put it there, by the time you know, it might be too late. Okay? So, waiting, let me repeat that, waiting to have more politically usable information to fight illiberals more effectively typically restricts the range of countermeasures that can be used, and with it, the likelihood of success. And this applies both in prevention and resistance scenario. Let's go a little bit more into that. Endogenous information. Endogenous information on illiberals' intentions come from their activity. So endogenous, why? Because it comes from the illiberals themselves. And it grows. I put time on the x-axis. There's no teleology here, right? It's just, time is the dimension of variation in which the activities of illiberals and the importance and the dangerousness of illiberals grows. So the more important illiberals become, the more information they release, they reveal, I should say, on their goals. This applies, as I said, to both prevention and resistance. In a scenario of resistance, it's pretty obvious. The more the government backslides, the more it becomes clear that liberal democracy is under threat, which may not be clear at all at the very beginning of the process. And I'll say something more about that. In a prevention scenario, the larger an illiberal organization becomes, the more likely it is that, the image of institutional opposition or, let's say, of potential governing party will be damaged, that the mask will slip. Why? For different reasons. Because an organization that becomes bigger is more difficult to control from the leadership, right? The leadership wants to give an institutional moderate image, but then maybe the sub-leaders or the elites in the periphery are not so clever. And therefore, they let go some utterances that reveal that the party is not that moderate after all. There's more attention when the organization becomes bigger on the part of the media, and therefore more likelihood that this real intention of illiberals will be revealed. So the more this is revealed depends on the rise of the threat. So this endogenous information line goes up. Note that, as I said, this is not private information on the part by pro-democratic actors. This is information that needs to be politically usable. It needs to be usable to convince other parties to coordinate, to convince part of electors to vote for them, and so on. We can talk more about this later. Let's look at counter strategies. As illiberals rise in influence and activities reveals their intention, as I said before, the range of possible counter-strategies shrinks. This is, again, true in both prevention and resistance scenarios. In a prevention scenario, well, it's pretty obvious that if a liberal party is 5% strong, more things can be done to stop it with more success, more likelihood of success, than if a illiberal party is 30% strong. This seems pretty obvious. In a resistance scenario, the more a government that is illiberal backslides, the more it closes off spaces for democratic opposition. The more media it takes over, the more courts it takes over, and so on, the less can the pro-democratic opposition do. So essentially, there is a trade-off between these two. Okay? Between endogenous information, that is to say, how much illiberals, by growing, reveal of their nature, and range of viable counter-strategies, what can be done against them in these two scenarios. So, analogously to what happens across the three scenarios, even within the scenarios of prevention and the scenario of resistance, there is a trade-off between these two. As information goes up, because illiberals become more dangerous, the range of what can be done goes down. Now, let me explain the graph briefly. Line A, as you can see, is the information line. It goes up with time. Line B is the counter strategy time. It goes down with time. Okay? The two lines are not on the same level, not on the same plane. They don't meet in reality. You can set exogenously, what I call I star, the level at which, in a certain liberal democracy, information will be enough for pro-democratic actors to act successfully against, or to act, to be called to act, let's say, against illiberals. However, at that time, what they can do is given by the segment perpendicular to A that identifies the level of counter strategies on the line B, which is CM star. It's relatively low. Now, of course, as I said, there's no teleology here. Second, these lines don't have to be straight. They can be, these are straight for just simplicity, but they are in trade-off however you draw them. And also, their slope is notional, of course. But their slope means something. If we set the level at which pro-democratic forces will react in a certain liberal democracy at I star, then the slope of A, of the line A, simply means how much information in a specific country pro-democratic forces will need to respond. Okay? And this incorporates a lot history, for example. In some countries, they might be more aware because they have specific past examples in mind, right? Politics of memory and so on. The more historical forewarning you have coming from the history of a certain country, the steeper A will be, okay? So T star will move close to the origin. There will need less time to react against illiberals. The slope of B instead incorporates information on the legacies of certain countries. Is civil society very lively? Well, then, they can do a lot with civil society, so that slope will be flatter, and so on. Does the country have a tradition of militant democracy that is accepted? Well, again, they can do more. And therefore, the time will be closer to the origin. Okay. So, having said that, we can say that CM star may or may not be sufficient in any specific country to react against illiberals with success. What makes it more likely to be sufficient is exogenous factors. And I focus on two of them. One is exogenous information, and the other one is institutional legacies. Exogenous information favors earlier coordination and intervention by pro-democratic forces. When there is to say earlier, remember the slope of B, when a larger array of countermeasures is available and viable, and therefore success is more likely, they can do more things, okay? Institutional legacies, I focus on unfavorable institutional legacies because they have the opposite effect to that. But I will talk about legacies more generally in a moment. Unfavorable legacies delay intervention. Why is that? I'll say it in a second. But the problem is that by delaying intervention, the timing is off, and the range of viable counter strategies shrinks, and therefore chances of success are lower. So let's look at this too. This is just the graph that I showed you just now. Exogenous information acts in this way. At every point in time, having information that does not come from the illiberals' activity, but comes from somewhere else, and we'll talk about what this somewhere else could be in 1 second, means that the whole of A shifts up. Therefore, setting I star exogenously, you can imagine that as being different in different countries, relatively to the slope of A, to the line A prime allows earlier intervention, but at an earlier point in time, the range of countermeasures that are viable goes up. And that means the success is more likely. Again, this is probabilistic, right? I'm not saying this will always work. But ceteris paribus, pro-democratic forces will be able to do more if they know more earlier on about the nature of the potential threat in both a prevention and a resistance scenario. So let me tell you how this applies in practice in a resistance scenario and in a prevention scenario, and give you very brief empirical illustrations. So let's start with resistance. At the beginning, as we all know, backsliding is gradual, it's incremental, is very often legalistic. That is to say, the government in power has intentions to break down checks and balances, but they tend to do it by respecting procedures or respecting laws and not openly violating procedures and law. And they do it very gradually. So at the beginning, it's very difficult to understand what they want to do. Orban's first reform was a change in the pension age of judges. That allowed him to get rid of all judges that he considered communists and his enemies, but in fact, the reform was very technical. Wasn't clear at all that he was breaking down checks and balances. It became clear later when he did his constitutional reform, then in 2014, when he declared that his model of democracy was illiberal and not liberal, but by then, he had already backslided a lot. So the endogenous information here at the beginning is very, very low, so the uncertainty is very high. But then incremental, cumulative reforms make the intentions of the government increasingly clear. And another thing that the literature on this, which is now ample, has found is that this gradualism is causal, meaning step 1 makes step 2 easier, and step 2 makes step 3 easier, and so on and so forth. So by the time government's intention become clear, the space for democratic opposition might be much reduced. So we might be at that, CM star, which is very low on the B line, a very small range of countermeasures that are viable. Exogenous information might change that. Now, where does exogenous information come from? Well, there might be several sources. In the paper, I give one example, which is diffusion. Diffusion and intertemporal comparison. And the example here is Israel. So what happened in Israel? As you will know, the new Netanyahu government, Likud and allies government, announced judicial reforms very, very soon after taking power, in December 22, early January 23. Well, I've interviewed Israeli lawyers about this. I can guarantee to you that these reforms are quite technical, in the sense that, for example, limit the possibility of the Supreme Court to use certain concepts in what they do in reviewing legislation. So it's very difficult to mobilize on the basis of technical reforms or the opposition to technical reforms. So one semantic shortcut that the opposition used was the intertemporal comparison with negative foreign examples. Essentially what they did a lot of things, but this was quite prominent. They said, look, if we don't oppose these reforms now, we will be, in some time, like Hungary is today, or Poland is today. These are the two big comparators that they used. They were present in the press, they were present in the slogans of the demonstrators, and they were very much in the mind of the leaders of the protest. They even shot mini lectures, small videos that were circulated on the situation in Hungary and Poland, of 1-2 minutes to summarize, hey, this is what they're living through now, and this is their present, will be our future if we don't do now what they didn't do years ago, when the thin end of the wedge of these judicial reforms was being passed and nobody really paid much attention. So what is that? Of course, this only models until 7th of October, then after that everything changed. But it's very close to the graph that I was showing you before. Simply, exogenous information at a very early time in that graph provided a jump in the publicly usable information that opponents could use, and therefore they could mobilize much more than they would have been able to do had they waited until Netanyahu had backslided more. How does it work in a scenario of prevention? Well, prevention is different. Of course, legalism is on the side of the Democrats. What's the dynamic of endogenous information? Well, the dynamic of endogenous information is what I was saying before. Illiberal parties, when they're marginal, they might be extreme, but when they aim or have the ambition to play a role in the political system, they try to say that they're not so illiberal after all. They try to present a double discourse, a front stage versus a backstage discourse. So to their members and militants, they speak in one way. To the outside world, the other parties or the general public, they offer a different image. As I said before, as a liberal party rises, becomes bigger organizationally and in terms of following, it's more difficult to keep that moderate image intact for the reasons that I said before. But again, by the time there's enough endogenous information on the nature that this illiberal party represents, then the range of viable strategies might have shrunk to a point that it's no longer possible to stop them. So what is exogenous information here? Again, there's a lot of possible sources. But one of them, for example, is journalistic reporting. This doesn't always work. And in the project, we are investigating when it works and when it doesn't. But think about Germany in early 24. There was a very well known report of a journalistic outlet named Correctiv that infiltrated a secret meeting of AfD people with other well-known neo-Nazis, and also a couple of CDU politicians, unfortunately. So this was then revealed, and that triggered a lot of demonstrations against the AfD in Germany, across the whole country, which in turn led to a dip in the polls for the party. Of course, the party is back, because Germany is a quite complex case. Probably was too big at the time to recede in the polls stably. The real problem in Germany is that there's an East and a West in which the double discourse works very differently. There's different things you can say in public in the East and in the West. So it's very difficult to defeat the AfD just with one bout of demonstrations. Probably there would be needed more sustained demonstrations and synergy between different actors. But after the demonstrations, the then Minister of Interior Affairs even said that the AfD should be banned. And the AfD is now monitored by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the whole party, as opposed to its youth wing, as it was the case before. Okay. Second exogenous factor, institutional legacies. So what are institutional legacies? Are the conditions for the three types of strategies that I mentioned before, formal, informal, and mobilizational, that pre-exist the appearance of a new challenge, a new illiberal challenge. So, does the country already have legislation that restricts extremism and that is generally accepted by the pro-democratic forces? How independent and trusted are courts and bureaucracies? Do parties have strong organizations that, deliver a very strong form of gatekeeping against maverick candidates? Are there constitutional conventions that would disfavor a new illiberal parties? How vibrant and lively is civil society, and so on. This is, again, different in the three scenarios. And again, this is the table that I showed you before, just to remind you. Ideally, this table shows the range that is ideally viable in each scenario. And as we said before, the stronger the liberals, the narrower the range. But not all countermeasures that are ideally possible in the boxes of that table will necessarily be present in all liberal democracies that find themselves in each of these three scenarios. Ideally possible is not historically available. Two countries might be in the same scenario, but have completely different legacies. Okay? Let me give you an example. As I said before, a country where in a regime of a scenario of prevention may have a very elaborate and well-accepted system of legal restrictions and jurisprudential traditions that implement that. And in other countries, this might be completely non-existent. One country might have strong parties that therefore prevent the takeover from illiberal or maverick candidates. Any reference to the American president is intentional here. Other countries may not, like the US. Some countries may have a very vibrant pro-democratic civil society, which is ready to organize and ready to go. Strong cultural protest, as it's called. Other countries may not. So, if these conditions pre-exist the emergence of a new illiberal challenge, be this in the government or in the opposition, countermeasures can be enacted quickly, as soon as information is sufficient to mobilize and coordinate against illiberals. If not, well, there will be a need for political capital to put in place this coordination, to coordinate about accepting and putting in place new measures, and this will delay response, therefore decreasing the chances of success. So, graphically, this works like that. Again, this is the same graph as before, simply the line A shifts down. So that difference between A and A second is simply that due to the delay that is necessary to coordinate on creating new measures. And sometimes even the resources, think about organizing civil society. It doesn't happen in a day, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of money. So essentially, unfavorable legacies have the opposite effect of exogenous information. Favorable legacies simply leave A where it is. Unfavorable legacies simply push it down. Of course, these magnitudes, again, are notional. What I'm trying to say here is that unfavorable legacies might counteract the effect of exogenous information. What are the implications, therefore? How do favorable legacies act? Well, they act as focal points. This is the famous book by Schelling in 1960, Nobel Prize for Economics. They are salient, they are present. There's a militant democracy legislation that is accepted by everybody. Well, it's there, right? They don't need to do anything politically. The government might just implement it bureaucratically. So there's no need for political capital. There's need for acquiescence, which is much easier. Is a civil society, strong civil society already there? Well, it's ready to go. You don't need to, engage in new organization, convince people, and so on and so forth. Even though just a word of caveat here, not all old solutions fit new challenges. Not everything that was good before, which is essentially what legacies are, necessarily will work with the new challenge that is emerging. The example is what I said before. The ex-minister for Interior Affairs in Germany said, well, we should probably ban the AfD. Well, the AfD is 20% strong. Germany did ban parties in the past, but they were much smaller. Are we sure that that is actually a viable strategy against the AfD? I mean, reasonable people might disagree, but there's reasons for skepticism here. So there is this word of caution that we need to have, but certainly favorable legacies help. That's the point. The second point about favorable legacies that I want to make is that they connect this analysis, which is actor-based and theorizes democratic agencies, which is what normally is not done in this literature, legacies connect this with structuralist views. Who has favorable legacies? Well, likely more established liberal democracies, right? They differ a lot in that sense, but they're more likely on average to have them than less consolidated liberal democracies. As I said before, it doesn't mean that the right legacies will always be available. By right, I mean the ones that will allow to defeat the new challenge, but certainly that will tendentially be better off than developing democracies. Second point, however, and again, this is a connection but also a difference with structuralist views of democracy, is that resilience is not automatic. Legacies need to be activated. It's not enough to have a strong civil society if nobody demonstrates, if nobody organizes. It's not enough to have informal conventions that discriminates against illiberals in parliament if nobody actually does that and coordinates to do that. Okay, let me get to the last part of the lecture and say something about the third scenario that I didn't talk about, which is the one of containment. As I said before, illiberals in this scenario are on the brink of power. I'll go a little faster on this, because this pertains to the analysis of the long term, which is something that doesn't fit in this lecture. But just for completeness, containment is not typically associated with the emergence of a new challenge, right? New challenges either emerge in government, a bit paradoxically, but that's what happened, or they rise from nothing, and therefore prevention. So containment generally follows either prevention or resistance. Therefore, the temporal paradox does not apply. It's not a dynamic scenario. You might remember I defined dynamic scenarios as those in which the level of threat changes within the same scenario. Here it doesn't. In a containment scenario, illiberals are strong and on the brink of power. That's it. Otherwise, it's a different scenario. Information on illiberals is therefore likely to be very high, because it comes from a previous scenario. They've already backslided and they've been kicked out. Nobody has any doubt that the Polish opposition today is illiberal, right? Because they've done that for 8 years. And other examples are possible too. There's also no change over time, since the liberals are not changing in strength, of the range of counter strategies that are available, right? They tend to be there and they tend to be fixed. Legacies are quite inflexible. They're there, and they are what they are. The electorate, this is the same as in many resistance scenarios, is generally split almost equally on the very meaning of the term democracy. So again, this ambiguity is always there, but the two sides in a containment scenario are roughly equal. So what to do in a containment scenario? It's a long-term matter. It's a matter of trenches warfare. Stop illiberals from attaining power in the short term and try to either change their mind or erode them down in the longer term. So ultimately, there's only two ways out, but both of them are longer term. Either liberals moderate, and therefore, they become part of the democratic system, or they are defeated electorally to a point that they are no longer on the brink of power. And then we go back to one of the two scenarios that I mentioned before. There's some literature on this, but is, in my view, very inadequate to understand the dynamics of containment. Also because it was probably developed with different empirical references in mind. So the long-term analysis that I am building on this consists essentially of the analysis of a series of episodes or challenges in which countries navigate different scenarios. For example, the US, 2016-20 is a scenario of resistance, followed by a scenario of containment, followed by another scenario of resistance. Poland, resistance, and now containment, and so on and so forth. This, again, I'm just sketching this at this stage because I'm going towards the end here, also allows integrating the dynamics that I talked about today that are short-term dynamics, because again, this is what's urgent now, with the analysis of long-term processes. Those policies that I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, how to attain economic growth, how to increase redistribution, reduce unemployment, foster civic education, and so on. These are all things that take a long time. In the meantime, you need to have short-term strategies. And so this is the next step in the theorization. The research agenda that emerges from this is three prongs. The first one is the variation of institutional legacies and the causes of that variation. We know surprisingly little about the legacies that I put in the big table that I showed you before. Some of them are covered in the literature, some of them are not so well covered, some of them are virtually ignored. So there's a need for systematic knowledge of those, and there's a need for comparative analysis of their causes, of their variation across time and space. Second, information. What are the dynamics and the sources of endogenous information, of ambiguity, and what are the effects of exogenous information and the sources of that exogenous information? And I gave you examples before, but these need to be much extended. And then, third, as I just mentioned, long-term analysis as a sequence of episodes of challenge. The change of how do the main parameters of the model change in the longer term. So let me conclude. To understand why liberal democracies keep illiberals from taking over is necessary to theorize democratic agency. This is not normally done enough, and this is what this project aims to do. To do so, we need to pitch the analysis at the correct level of abstraction. We need to step back from the data. We don't need first-order lists of things that would be desirable. We need to analyze the condition of viability of desirable things. Third, broaden the perspective. Don't just look at backsliding and resistance to backsliding, because countries cycle or are likely to cycle between different scenarios. And again, as I said before, illiberals are not born in government, even though sometimes, as it happens, they have been. Consider short-term countermeasures and counter-strategies systematically, because short-term intervention is urgent. Long-term strategies, of course, we all want civic education and economic growth and no unemployment and all that, of course. But they might take too long to have effects. And then do the research that I said before. Research the effects of information legacies and the dynamics of sequences of episodes of change. So to conclude, in studying responses to illiberalism, we need to take temporalities, that is in the title of this lecture, very, very seriously. time and timing are key. And getting the timing of intervention against illiberals right or getting it wrong has long-lasting consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanni, for this very topical, insightful, and highly interesting keynote lecture. I think there is a lot to digest and to discuss, and I hope that in this panel section of this event, we have a possibility to address also some of the key points raised in your lecture. My name is Juha Jokela, and I work in the Finnish Institute of International Affairs as a program director for the EU research program. And I'm also involved in the RESLIDE consortium in research activities as well as the stakeholder interaction. And in this capacity, it is my great pleasure also now to welcome on the podium our fellow panelists. First, I would like to invite Tuija Brax, who is the director of the Rule of Law Center in Helsinki University. And this audience knows Tuija very well as well because she has a very long and distinguished career as a politician. She was a member of the Finnish Parliament from 1995 to 2015. She has served as the chairperson of the Green Party, as well as a Minister of Justice in government from 2007 to 2011. Please welcome to podium. Our other fellow panelist is Inga Saikkonen, who is a senior university lecturer in the Åbo Academy University and one of the key senior researchers of the RESLIDE project or our consortium. Inga's research centers on citizen support on democracy in Finland and beyond, including youth democracy attitudes. So warm welcome to this panel as well. So after the introductions and the keynote, we now have a bit less than an hour for the panel discussion. And I will perhaps start with the question to Giovanni immediately, and then we move on to the other panelists. You talked a lot about the temporal dimension and its importance, and you also, towards the end of your lecture, talked about the scenario related to the on the brink of power, the illiberals on the brink of power. What kind of counter strategies could there be? If we look at the Nordic states, for instance, I think this has been with us for quite some time already. So challenger parties, right-wing populist parties, have been on the brink of power for a long time. They have entered the government in some countries. They have acted as a kind of supporters of the minority parties. They have also act as a majority partners in coalition governance in this kind of consensual coalition government political systems. So my question to you is, in a way, when this becomes kind of the new normal, that the challenger parties are on the brink of the power all the time, has this worked, the counter strategy to include them and either make them moderate or then try to defeat the electorate? They defeat them by reducing the electoral support for them. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Now, there's two issues here. One is whether accommodation works, meaning if you take these parties in a coalition with other democratic parties, does this make them more moderate? Well, my colleagues argue very passionately about that. My impression is simply that there is not enough evidence to say that this would automatically moderate them. It's a very old argument. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon American, and especially political science, when they never had to do that, in fact. So they could do that. They could theorize that more easily. The idea is either a mechanism of responsibility, meaning they will have to take decisions, and therefore they will see that all the things that they promise from the opposition cannot be maintained, and therefore they have to moderate in order to be able to even survive. Another mechanism is that of one of socialization. These are outsiders, one that they brought in, they will be socialized to the processes of power in a democracy, and therefore they will understand that many things that they say are not possible, and therefore they will moderate. Have these two mechanisms worked? I don't think that the answer is unequivocally yes. Because at the same time, bringing illiberal parties in can give them more power, more visibility, and may not necessarily guarantee any form of moderation. But again, the jury is still out on this. If you don't bring them in, then in a situation of containment, the things that can be done are not many, because they've already shrunk from what was possible earlier on. A situation of containment is one in which an illiberal opposition party is one election away from winning power. So many formal strategies of legal restrictions and repression are not viable. There might be some, but most of them are not. Informally, in Parliament, well, you can still exclude them from many things, but, for example, whenever you need a supermajority to do anything, because the Constitution dictates that, then you have to include them. And you cannot no longer, and therefore you give them more power and so on, as I was saying before. And even when a supermajority is not necessary to uphold certain conventions, for example, there are some countries in which the opposition party, the main opposition party, gets the presidency of some important parliamentary committees. Well, of course, the majority that is still pro-democratic might prevent that. But then, by doing so, they'd be violating a convention, and they will appear as somebody that doesn't want to be checked by these external by this parliamentary committee. So in any case, it puts them in a very difficult situation. So the only thing that is done is, that is left really is to have a synergy between governmental and majoritarian policies and mobilization in the streets, because that is still possible, and that might have an effect.
Thank you very much. And now look to Tuija and Inga. Do you want to comment the same question about the inclusion, exclusion, parties on the brink?
I am tempted to say that there doesn't seem to be enough evidence. And if you compare different countries and different sort of illiberal models of being illiberal in a way, they differ so much. For example, that I haven't found in any of the Scandinavian or the Nordic countries that there would already be sort of a direct attacks, for example, against the judiciary, for example, what happened in Poland and Hungary. So this also brings it, at least for me, really difficult to answer to that. It's easy to say as a former politician that that's a really fair and good question. Thank you.
And then Inga.
Thank you. I'm in the lines of Giovanni and Tuija here. The jury is still out, but also I would like to point out that the socialization argument that presupposes some kind of normative agreement of core liberal democratic values, and what we are seeing increasingly also in survey data, divergence of support for various dimensions of democracy, but also increasing willingness to support authoritarian alternatives. So the socialization argument presupposes that there's some kind of consensus on viable alternatives or viable strategies, and we are seeing increasingly that this is very rapidly eroding also in established democracies.
Thank you. Thank you for these snap questions for the beginning.
Juha, could I just, by the way, just that this won't stay there on website without correction, that it's probably Sirpa Rautio's title there after my name. So that, yeah.
Yes. I have to apologize that. So yes,
I just noticed it. So
Tuija Brax is the director of the Rule of Law Center in the Helsinki University, and somehow there is a wrong title in the program. But we do apologize that, and we hope that this is now clear for all the audience.
Yeah, Sirpa Rautio will give me a hard time if she thinks that I have pretended to be her. So.
We do know Sirpa very well, and we will apologize her as well when we next time meet her. But my next question is to you, Tuija, and it relates to your current function as the director of the Rule of Law Center here in Helsinki University. You've been, of course, following very closely the developments at the European regional level as well as globally. And it would be very interesting to hear your analysis and assessment. What are the kind of key negative developments in relation to rule of law? And potentially also, are there any positive developments in this kind of big pictures that we have witnessed recently? And the background obviously is that the rule of law is one of the key fundamental pillars of liberal democracy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we use this triangle also, maybe the trinity of the human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. That, for example, the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission is sort of have put it in a very short version. What is part of this liberal democracy? I think Åsa already took the main points, what we know for sure from internationally about the situation. I sometimes use the sort of a soccer term that if we think that there are approximately 8 billion people in the world, so it's 9, sort of 2 against 6, that the sort of anti-rule of law, the liberal Democrats are now the underdogs. And the other ones are sort of, if you think about the people living in the countries where there is something that is not, or that cannot be described as a sort of a liberal democracy with a proper rule of law in its broad version. And in that calculation, the approximately 300 million citizens of the United States of America are still counted to this too. So, maybe the other sort of a sport wording would be that we are not sort of maybe not keeping even our position in the league, that we are not sort of, it doesn't look like that let's have a break and think about the new strategy and we will at the end of the day do like the Swedes always do in ice hockey, that we will win this game. So it doesn't look good. That's the overall. But then sometimes there has been already really good counterforce. What happened in Slovenia, I don't think we haven't noticed that it was first a really big backslide for illiberals and then totally the other way around. And what exactly happened was what you were describing, that all the other forces in the country united behind one really good and sort of, how would I say, very, very, very good person that was really good in television and could unite everybody. And at the moment, at least, I think that it stays that way. What happened in Poland was interesting, but then on the other hand, the presidential elections again. So I wouldn't say that within Europe this is a game that we keep on losing. But then after the US aid cut downs and all the sort of mechanisms, how we have tried to sort of wing new countries to our side, so to say, in Africa or eastern part of the globe, or in South America, this is getting more and more difficult. It is really a huge step back that US aid was taking down, and most of the European countries has also cut their foreign aid for development aid, particularly in this field.
Yes, and of course it's one of the elements of EU's external action in terms of development policy has been also the democratic credentials and the kind of the conditionalities attached to that. I think I know that you've been following this as well, how that has been developed. Do you have any view on this, how EU's actness as a kind of a promoter of liberal democracy, rule of law in its external relations development policy has developed?
Well, there is a quite interesting report from the Court of Auditors from Luxembourg, I think 2 years ago. It was number 1/22, 3 years, oh my God, already, that they sort of scrutinized the rule of law work done by the funding of EU in Western Balkans. And they already said that there might be a danger, or they were very actually quite strict about it, that it doesn't really make a change for certain reasons. These processes don't involve civil society, free press, and sort of a diversity of the press, and particularly anti-corruption methods. So already before these cuttings, there might have been some sort of shortcomings in the work we do. But now, after these terrible cuttings, it's obvious that this is going to be much more difficult. And as I think most of the people would say, that it's getting more and more geopolitical all the age. So it's not only this, what Finland or other countries are saying, that in some perspective you expect the country to follow Finland's political wishes. It's becoming more and more geopolitical in all the continents, done by all the countries. And I've understood that the Commission has said that there is no way that Europe at the moment, because of the Russians' terrible attack on Ukraine and the need to put money on defense, which I fully understand, that EU could somehow replace what US took. So it is difficult. It's really difficult.
Difficult, complicated, and worrying picture. And now to Inga. You've done extensive research on citizen support for democracy and liberal democratic norms, and this, of course, connects your work quite closely also with Giovanni's keynote and research interests. So I would like to ask you, what do we know about citizen support for non-democratic politicians, illiberal, even perhaps even anti-democratic, authoritarian politicians and decision makers? In other words, what is the risk that people will vote authoritarian politicians like Hungary's Viktor Orban in some of the long-standing liberal democracies, including Finland, of course?
Yes, so there is the short answer. Our research has uncovered a latent potential for this to happen also in Finland. This might sound really shocking, but I'll explain the mechanism and behind this. Increasingly, we have seen in opinion polls globally that, in general, citizens still prefer living in a democratic regime. They don't want to be governed by authoritarians. At the same time, we have seen that even in established democracies, such as in the US, we have seen that voters are willing to back openly anti-democratic politicians, even if they have full information about the democratic, anti-democratic credentials of those politicians. An increasing number of experimental experiments have shown that in other established democracies, such as in Germany or in Sweden, there is latent potential for this to happen also in established democracies in Europe, where we still see high levels of citizen support for democracy in abstract. But the reason why this happens is there's this inherent vulnerability built into representative elections. So representative elections ask us to make difficult choices sometimes between different candidate attributes. So in elections, we have to choose whether we support candidates or parties because of their ideological positions or for other attributes. And we conducted these experimental studies, which were embedded in surveys in Finland in 2020 and 22 with my colleague Henrik Christensen at Åbo Academy to see whether also in Finland respondents would prioritize democratic principles over other policy benefits. And what we found was that substantial segments of respondents were willing to prioritize policy congruence or ideological congruence over democratic principles. So we found in one study close to 50% or more than 50% of the respondents were willing to back an undemocratic candidate in this kind of hypothetical situation, which tried to simulate a real electoral situation. In this kind of, when they were asked to make these trade-offs, when there was policy congruence between the respondent and the politician. So there's this inherent vulnerability built in democratic systems that Milan Svolik from Yale University has highlighted in much of his work, and we found that this mechanism potentially exists also in Finland. This was one of the reasons why we think this project is really important, that we shouldn't take democratic norms for granted. We shouldn't take the role of citizens as being kind of the ultimate guardians of democracy for granted, even though citizens still in Finland, in the same survey, express preferences for living in a democratic regime. But there's this inherent vulnerability built in liberal democracies that we should be aware of.
Yes, indeed. And I think when we have had our initial discussions in the consortium, we also noted that the times of war in Europe, for instance, and increasing security policy challenges points to the well-established academic literature on securitization. And this is obviously something which might play a role also in citizens' attitudes when the new surveys are done, whether there is more sort of room for maneuver in thinking about some non-democratic, undemocratic proposals and campaigns as well. But now I would like to ask whether, Giovanni, you want to come in and if you have any thoughts or comments what you just heard.
Yes, no, Inga, can you repeat the percentage of Finnish respondents? That
In one experiment, about 50% of the respondents who were in the same side with the politician, so not everybody, but those about 50% of the respondents who represented the same side in a policy issue that the hypothetical politician.
Right, so those would be able to trade off democracy for policy benefits. But it's 50% is a lot, right?
Yes.
But that might be a silver lining there, like maybe a reason for optimism. 50% is an awful lot, but there's another 50% that is there and is persuadable. Okay, because what Milan Svolik and many others found out is very good and also stopped many, especially in the American Democratic Party, many people believed that the problem was just increasing turnout. You increase turnout, democracy will be fine. No, you increase turnout, democracy may not be fine because it depends on what people want and believe, on their attitudes vis-a-vis democratic values or non-democratic values. And so discovering this trade-off, and then there's more work on various forms of rationalization that people say, well, I want this policy to happen, and what you're presenting me as a trade-off with democracy, in fact, it's not a trade-off with democracy, because this action is also democratic. So they extend policy preferences to the redefinition of democracy. But that does not mean that everybody is like that.
Yeah.
It's a good alarm bell to have, but at the same time, it means that the strategies that I talk about that are all based on coordination and mobilization on the part of pro-democratic actors have a public, have an audience. And that's the difference between the short term and the long term. You might need a long term to convince people that believe that autocracy is fine as long as they get the policy preferences. But in the short term, you may mobilize the people that don't do that.
Yes.
Thank you. Indeed. Now I would like to get back to Tuija, because we heard from Inga about the citizens' support, and also from Giovanni some ideas how to work on that. One element, obviously, is that how committed politicians as well as public administration, so the civil servants, for instance, in countries like Finland or the Nordic countries, are to the liberal democratic norms. And as you have a very long and extensive political career, it would be nice to hear your view on that matter. So how committed, in your overall assessment, politicians and public administrations are to liberal democratic norms, and have there been any recent sort of shifts, for instance, what you have noticed?
Yeah, I have to be really cautious here, because when I left the parliament more than 10 years ago, I sort of really wanted to sort of do something else. And at least for the first 5 years when I was working outside the politics, I really sort of made an effort not to be that much involved. So there might be some really important parts of the political life that I'm not aware of. So just be careful that I'm not an expert anymore in all the details of the current Finnish policy. But I would say that, for example, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs still, for example, provides, funds our institution in the Helsinki University, gives a signal that these values when it comes to foreign policy and particularly developing policy of thinking that the rule of law, also they are funding democracy work, and sort of NGO world quite still substantially, even though there has been cut downs, shows that there hasn't been any sort of that kind of a dramatic switch over like what happened in America. At least sort of a signals that sort of a basic values, even though the parties obviously disagree over the volume and the money, then where should the cuttings be, seems to be there. I would say that it's more difficult to say that how should you sort of think about the fact that some of the sort of quite boring looking elements of rule of law, like proper impact assessments, or that how do you evaluate science, how much do you put effort also in all the academic work, not only that you think that might bring money on a short term, or that how well have you resources to properly prepare laws, vis-a-vis that you decide quite rapidly and maybe listen to the interest groups more, that how much is that different now, or was it a little bit more hidden in the previous years? But there seems to be something, at least when it comes to impact assessments and sort of a proper preparations, that might ring a bell. But that if you would test people, that how many people would go to Market Square and demonstrate against that we don't have proper impact assessments anymore, or that there isn't any enough stuff in the ministries to properly prepare laws, so that NGOs and academia and a proper discussion of maybe better alternatives in law drafting would be discussed, or that within the parliament the processes should be, as they used to be, longer and more what I say, deeper when it comes to listening to the experts. I don't think that at this stage, when people really fear, this is sort of a fear of security issues, for example, fear for their jobs, fear for the future of the children because of the climate change, Russia is there. These sort of tiny little things that might be there in the air are not that concrete and not that big that one would get people sort of stand up and fight. And it might be also that they are not that big that people even should stand up and fight. But that kind of a changes I can detect.
Yes. And maybe a follow-up, because we all remember you from the national politics from for 2 decades, and obviously at that time you were participating a lot with other parties and politicians, also the MPs. So do you have any kind of memories from that time, in a way that you mentioned the triangle, like human rights, rule of law, minority protections, for instance, that in a way, how deeply rooted those were within the Finnish politicians, in a way, in the parliament and also in the ministry? Were there sort of was the sense in a way that they were there, they were really highly valued, recognized values of liberal democracy, or was it something that was not necessarily discussed or understood?
Before the economic crisis 2008, I would say that there was this sort of a golden age also in the Finnish politics. It's not only in Finland, but in other countries as well, where in Finland then it's happened that we rewrote our constitution first in 95, the new list of fundamental rights.
Yes.
That was one of the most progressive and best, one of the very first constitutions within Europe where the environment was mentioned in the list of fundamental rights, and a little bit differently than most of the rights, or that the right for good governance was listed there. And then at the turn of the century, when we took further steps towards proper parliamentarism, sort of a stepping out almost all the final steps away from the sort of more, how would I say, authoritarian presidential model. And for example, when I was nominated to be the other negotiator for EU and the Convention of Fundamental Rights and the Charter, so it was me and Gunnar Jansson from the Swedish-speaking People Party, sort of 2 smaller parties, but lawyers sort of specialized in human rights, and the vast majority of the whole parliament was backing our nomination because the consensus was so huge that they thought that since we are the specialists, they trusted us, and we were the ones who the Finnish parliament sent. That's just a tiny little example that could that happen today, that somebody from a smaller party, or even at the time Greens were in the opposition, would be sent as one of the negotiators. So there might have been a change, and that Finland was really lucky that these really big reforms were done at the time when it looked that environmental things are going to be handled, democracy was appreciated, economics was doing good, Nokia was there. This sort of a fear, the socialist Bormann says liquid fear, sort of a fear that things are getting really worried, but what makes people to maybe to look for these shortcuts that people support, they were not there. So that I can tell you.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting if we think about the temporal dimension also raised in the keynote lecture, because it kind of points out that some of the changes, for instance, in Finland towards liberal democracy or consolidating liberal democracy, institutionalizing it also with the constitution, are kind of quite recent actually, and relate to the 80s and 90s, and also the end of the Cold War and so forth. But now I go back to Inga, and we move from citizens to one group of citizens, youth and younger citizens. Perhaps you can also provide us a definition of what counts as a young citizen. But there is, of course, a lot of surveys and value attitude surveys, research out there about the views and democratic views of the youth. And one of the questions I think is important to answer, that are young generations undemocratic in their views, democratic attitudes, please?
Well, first to provide a quick definition, there are different ways of defining what are young citizens, but it's quite conventional to treat respondents under 30 years of age as representing kind of younger generations. But there's a huge literature out there on what constitutes younger generations and older generations. Perhaps I'm not going to open up that discussion here. But in general, there is this trend I mentioned globally that we are seeing increasing norm change. So one thing we see in global surveys is this. Democracy is a very multi-dimensional concept. And increasingly, we are seeing in surveys that there is kind of as I mentioned, universal support. People want to live in a democracy where people still uphold the norm of self-rule. But beyond that, there's very little, increasingly, much less consensus on different dimensions of democracy, and especially related to this project, norms of liberal democracy, checks and balances to executive power, and rule of law. And this is something that we see divergence, and there's new empirical evidence from Europe that suggests that younger citizens, among younger citizens, there's more skepticism towards liberal democratic norms as opposed to other dimensions of democracy. However, the picture is different for Finland. Among the RESLIDE project, we fielded surveys after the municipal elections in Finland. So the data is very recent. I'm speaking about very preliminary results here. These need further testing. These haven't been peer-reviewed. But what we couldn't find, we fielded questions that measure different dimensions of democracy and support for these different dimensions, including liberal democratic dimensions, checks and balances. And we couldn't find similar patterns in Finland, clear patterns that younger generations in Finland would have been more skeptical. But as I said, these are preliminary patterns. But also in related studies, we haven't found clear patterns that would suggest that in Finland, younger generations would be more skeptical towards liberal democratic values. But as I said, in other European studies, there are trends or apparent trends to this direction. So this is why we are going to gather panel data. We're going to measure these attitudes over time, because we are seeing increasing norm change, and this is what we are really interested in seeing, whether there's norm change over time and also in particular subsections of the population, including the youth.
Mm. Which also connects, obviously, very closely with the temporal factor. Yes. and the counter strategies theme. Now we have some 15 minutes, a bit more time left in this panel, and I would now like to open the question and answer session from the audience. So I will collect a number of questions. Also, if you have short comments, that's okay, but not very long one, from the audience, and then we will get back to this side of the table, so to say, or the podium. And I briefly ask you also introduce yourself, so name and affiliation is fine, and I see at least 2 hands already. Please, gentlemen in the second row.
I need a microphone.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Björn Sundell, previous editorial writer and journalist and former chairman of Amnesty International in Finland. This was a very interesting discussion and presentation. But I react when you talk about illiberals as groups, as parties, either in opposition or in parliament or in government. I think we have to see that there are populists and illiberals also in established liberal parties. Mm-hmm. There have been, and there have always been probably. And they get more power, or they try to bend their party in a more illiberal way when there is a crisis. It could be an economic crisis, it could be a pandemic. We saw it during the pandemic. We saw it during Finlandization phase in Finland long ago. And these traditional parties and their illiberals, my question to you is, how do we treat that? Because If we talk about groups, it's more abstract. It's easy to cover groups and trends in research. But if you talk about illiberals in traditional liberal parties, you have to name them. You have to name individuals, and that is a tricky question in research. It will be interesting for the public, of course, but it also makes the research more hot in a way. So what's the way, how do you think this should be treated? The fact that there are in liberal parties also always illiberal individuals who want to bend the party in an illiberal way.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very, very pertinent question, I would say. Also in this part of the world, but also more broadly in Europe, if we look at that matter. But then I saw another hand over there. Please, there is a microphone coming, so if you could wait a few seconds. And then I would ask if there are any other questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. Maria Makarov, University of Helsinki. So this is to Tuija Brax. So our keynote speaker called for activation of legacies and perhaps renovation of institutions supporting liberal democracy. What about our situation here in Finland? Do we have a need for that? And would there perhaps be a need for changes, relevant changes in our constitution in anticipation of threats towards liberal democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this important question as well for the panel. And then there was a person here in the second row. And I'm looking around if I see any other hands. Okay, then.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Danae Smith, and I work as a researcher with Aalto University. This was super interesting. My questions, if you would allow, are twofold, and I guess open to everyone, but mainly to Tuija and Inga. The one question is, you were talking about kind of the export of democratic values to other countries, the importance of that, the cuts of US aid. Fully agree with all of what you said, but we're also seeing a massive decline in multilateralism and its mechanism in support of these ideals. So thoughts in terms of that, do you think multilateralism, from what you've expressed with some treaties and conventions, still has a space, or are we looking at minilateralism and other mechanisms instead? So that's a top-down question. The other question is, when you're looking at liberal democracy, oftentimes when you meet like the short-term and the long-term kind of demands, how do you address, maybe Inga, citizen apathy? Because sometimes I'm speaking more from South African stance, so I know very little about Finland, but happy to learn as I'm here. In South Africa, we have great democratic values on paper and constitution, but when it comes to the apathy of long-term failure of democratic institutions and short-term needs, how do you address citizenship, well, not citizenship, but citizen apathy from a bottom-up approach? So kind of twofold questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these very good questions for the panel as well. And then I saw at least one hand here, the person in the third row.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm Lani Hartikainen from here at Helsinki. My question is mainly directed, I guess, to Giovanni and Inga. So I'm thinking about, Giovanni, in your speech, talking about this like preventative aspect and the graph and everything. And I'm wondering if there are cases where like strong institutional legacies, at least the way that I would see them as a non-expert in like this exact field of study, could actually work as like, could actually like tamper or hamper the responses to illiberalism. Like for example, in the US, where there was a whole lot of information about Trump's, about their plans, we had the whole Project 2025, but there was this really strong, I think, trust from a lot of people, also from the media, saying like, well, this could never happen here. And I think you see a whole, like a counterexample in the German case, where of course they do have memory of even far beyond illiberal systems. And I think you could also see this like perhaps in Slovenia or in Central Eastern Europe. I study the Czech case, and I think like there's a lot of that there. So and I think this is relevant for Finland, can like the hallmarks of a strong democracy, trust in the system, like legacies of resistance, can that actually hurt the strategies that you would normally turn to prevent the rise of illiberalism?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm now looking at my watch, and I think we have to get back to this side of the table. Perhaps we could go in a reverse order. So if we start with you, Inga, then Tuija,
Yes.
and Giovanni gets the final word.
We should be quite brief, I suppose.
Yes, we have some 6-7 minutes altogether.
Okay, I'll try to be
So
very
2
brief
minutes for you.
and answer maybe the last two questions. Can strategies or legacies actually hurt? I think that's a fantastic question, and this is something that I'm kind of implying in my previous answers. One of the key challenges in established democracies is that we have this kind of normalcy bias. We take the democratic system for granted. We don't have recent experience of what is living under authoritarian regimes. Citizens don't necessarily know when they lose their fundamental rights, including the right to due process. What implications does this actually have for individual citizens? So we take these democratic principles for granted and are perhaps willing to overlook them for short-term political benefits. This pertains to elites as well as citizens. So this is a key challenge in established democracies. Whether there's something that can be done to counter citizen apathy. Here I would like to maybe highlight some of the really cool research that is coming out of this project. We have colleagues of mine from the RESLIDE project have conducted mobilization experiments and which seek to mobilize low propensity voters, which don't normally turn out in elections. And these interventions, it was a field experiment, showed that some of these interventions actually work in terms of mobilizing low propensity voters. So this is something that there are some tools that we can use. There are some interventions that we have seen that do provide results. So some hopeful things to end this discussion with.
Thank you, that's excellent. And then Tuija, there was a question about
really, sorry,
constitutional
I cannot
changes.
answer all of them, but maybe one of the things that Giovanni said I would like to highlight as an answer to almost all the questions, or partially answer, that there isn't any silver bullet, or that there cannot be sort of a list of what needs to be done. So also when it comes to, for example, South America, there are different stories and different actions. And if you look at, for example, how in Uruguay or then maybe then Costa Rica, I dare to say, that for example in Costa Rica there are several mentions that there was a very strong institution, the one that provides elections, was such a stronghold that it created confidentiality towards parliamentarism, democracy, rule of law, and then in Uruguay it was the civil society and the younger generations who were so fed up with the corruption of the existing parties and made the difference. And then simultaneously in the next country where the constitution looked similar, nothing happened. So this is a really difficult question, and there seems to be different paths, different methods in different countries and situations. We could have another seminar on that. And then to Marika Makarov and the Finnish constitution, I think that that's a really good symbol of the current situation in Finland, that also the Minister of Justice, the current minister, my sort of a colleague Leena Meri, agreed upon when the president of the administrative Supreme Court, Kari Kuusiniemi, came out that just for the case of security, we need to have better safeguards, even in our constitution, to really to be better equipped for the situation that there would be a proper attack on democracy and rule of law in Finland, and that there is now several working groups within the Ministry of Justice to work on this issue. So I think that the answer is yes, and that there are really good processes ongoing in Finland. Unfortunately, the time doesn't give me chances to go back. I would have loved to talk about this liquid fear and 2008 more, because I think that really changed the world, that this economics, not only in Finland but worldwide, is now looking worse, and that plays in the favor of the populists quite a lot. We shouldn't overlook that liquid fear of the families and of the younger generation.
Thank you very much. And then Giovanni.
Yes, thank you. So just let me answer the questions that were addressed to me in the order that were asked. So how do we deal with populists and illiberals in parties that are not, per se, liberals and illiberals or illiberal or populists? Well, there's very little that is completely new in this. But if there's one thing that is relatively new, is exactly that, meaning that we have had in the last 2 decades, parties that had a history of moderation or mainstream politics that once in government simply changed phase and started breaking down checks and balances as if this was par for the course, right? Just a normal fare of democratic politics. And that's what characterized this, or characterizes still this period of democratic danger. What to do about that? Well, that's not new at all. It's gatekeeping, meaning parties themselves need to have structures that vigilate on the possible infiltration and takeover of maverick candidates that then turn illiberals because they don't have the same political culture of the party or the same history or the same roots and so on, the same brand, if you want. So it's a new problem, but it has a very old solution. The other point about whether institutional legacies can actually damage the prospects of defense of democracy. Well, yes. Institutional legacies, or more likely cultural legacies, can create complacency. And this certainly was the case in the US. It can never happen here. I'm not sure I completely agree with the view that there was a lot of information about Trump's illiberalism, at least not in the sense that I define information, that is to say, the politically usable information that can be used to coordinate and mobilize against illiberals, because each of us might have different views of whether we could tell in 2015 or in 2016 or in January 2017. I only noticed one thing. First of all, that immediately after the victory of Trump in 2016, in November 2016, the first thing that all Democratic leaders, starting with Hillary Clinton and Obama, and even Bernie Sanders did, in probably totally good faith, said, well, let's keep an open mind, okay? We don't know how this will pan out. So Trump himself, in his campaign, yes, of course, he was outrageous in his rhetoric, but this was simply defined as, by the aforementioned leaders, as kind of campaign hyperbole. Once he's in government, he will not do any of that. Trump did say things like, well, the Second Amendment people will take care of that, or, I'm not sure I'll accept the election result if I lose. But then he said the following day, well, I mean, obviously, legal challenges. He didn't say, if I lose, I'll storm Congress. If he had said that in 2015, probably we would have had a bit more information about that. So, but the point is that the Democratic opposition did not take that seriously. That might be a mistake, and mistakes are possible, but certainly that was not enough publicly usable information to mobilize.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanni, Tuija, and Inga. And I ask you to stay still. It is time to close this event, and I'll ask Åsa here on the podium with me. I only personally want to say that I have enjoyed truly this discussion. I also like the structure that we have had today, a kind of an academic keynote lecture and then the policy-oriented discussion after it as well. And I think it has worked well, and I can promise already now that the RESLIDE will do much more these type of events in the 6 years that we have to execute the project. Thank you from my behalf. Now back to Åsa.
Thank you, Johan. We'll be very brief. Thank you to all panelists for an excellent discussion. It was very informative, partly inspiring, but also very worrying. And thank you, Giovanni, for your really good speech. It gave a lot of food for thought for the RESLIDE consortium and for our research that will come. We will have almost 6 years. Some time has passed already, but we have almost 6 years left, and we will do our best to live up to the high expectations. We really need more research on the topic, and we are very grateful for the Strategic Research Council that they decided to fund our research endeavor. Also, thank you to all of you in the audience. Thank you for coming, and I hope you will show up if we arrange a new event, because apparently we promised several of these. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.